When my stepmother called me ungrateful, I thought maybe she was right. I had food, I had a roof, I had a family. But what she never understood was gratitude should never feel like fear. I was only 13 when I learned that being called ungrateful is sometimes just another way to control you. And the day my grandmother noticed the truth, everything changed. I was 13 when my life quietly split into two versions. One was the life I remembered, soft and warm, full of small certainties like coming home to a familiar smell and knowing exactly where I belonged. The other was the life I was expected to accept without complaint, a life where gratitude was demanded, not earned. My father remarried less than a year after my mother died. People said it was fast, but no one said it was wrong. Grief makes people uncomfortable, and his decision seemed to make everyone relax again. He wasn't alone anymore. The house wasn't silent anymore. That was supposed to be enough. For me, it wasn't. At first, my stepmother didn't seem cruel. She seemed efficient. She organized the house, changed routines, replaced furniture, and erased small things that had once felt permanent. Family photos disappeared from shelves. My mother's favorite curtain was replaced. Even the way dinner was served changed. Everything became sharper, cleaner, colder. I told myself this was what adjustment looked like. She never raised her voice. That was the worst part. Her disappointment lived in sighs, looks, and silence. When I forgot something, when I hesitated, when I asked for anything extra, she would remind me, softly, how lucky I was. Lucky to still have a roof. Lucky to still have food. Lucky my father had married someone willing to take me in. That word followed me everywhere. Lucky. By the time she called me ungrateful for the first time, the word felt familiar, almost earned. She said it after I refused to give up my room so her visiting sister could stay more comfortably. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I just said no. That single word seemed to offend her more than any rebellion ever could. From that day forward, ungrateful became my identity. Whenever I looked tired, it was ungrateful. Whenever I didn't smile enough, it was ungrateful. Whenever I missed my mother quietly, without explanation, it was ungrateful. Gratitude in her world meant silence. It meant obedience. It meant pretending I had never lost anything. My father didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He worked longer hours, came home exhausted, and trusted that peace meant everything was fine. When she complained about me, it was always framed as concern. Concern that I was difficult, concern that I wasn't adjusting well, concern that I didn't appreciate her sacrifices. And I started to believe her. I began apologizing for things I didn't understand, for existing too loudly, for being too quiet, for taking up space in a house that suddenly felt rented instead of owned. The only place I felt real again was during visits to my grandmother. She lived in a small house that smelled like old books and warm tea. Nothing there had been replaced. My mother still existed on the walls, in framed photos and handwritten notes. My grandmother never asked me to be grateful. She just let me be. But I didn't tell her the truth. Not yet. I didn't want to sound dramatic. I didn't want to cause problems. Most of all, I didn't want to confirm the fear that had been growing quietly inside me, that maybe I really was the problem. Back home, my stepmother became more controlled, more precise. She stopped correcting me directly and started correcting my character. She framed everything as lessons, lessons about humility, lessons about respect, lessons about remembering my place. I learned how to move through the house quietly, how to eat without leaving traces, how to finish chores before being asked. I became invisible, and she seemed pleased. But invisibility doesn't protect you forever. One evening, after a long day at school, I forgot to wash a single cup. Just one. It sat in the sink like evidence of a crime. When she found it, she didn't shout. She waited until my father came home. Then she spoke gently about how hurt she felt, about how unappreciated she was. about how difficult it was to raise a child who didn't respect effort. I stood there, listening to myself being described as someone else. My father looked tired, disappointed. He didn't ask for my side. He didn't need to. The story had already been told. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I felt wronged, but because I felt exposed, like my secret fear had finally been spoken out loud. Maybe I really was ungrateful. Maybe losing my mother had made me selfish. Maybe expecting kindness was too much. The word followed me into my dreams. Weeks later, during another visit to my grandmother, something changed. I don't know why that day was different. Maybe I was tired of carrying it alone. Maybe the weight had finally exceeded my strength. Or maybe part of me was hoping someone would tell me I wasn't crazy. I didn't plan to say anything, but when my grandmother looked at me, really looked, I felt something crack. She noticed the way I flinched when asked simple questions, the way I minimized myself, the way I apologized for existing in her space. She noticed the shadows under my eyes and the careful way I chose my words. She didn't accuse, she didn't interrogate, she simply paid attention, and for the first time in years, someone saw me. That was the beginning of the truth coming out. But at the time, I didn't know what it would cost. I didn't know what would unravel. I didn't know that calling someone ungrateful is sometimes just a way to hide cruelty behind virtue. And I didn't know that my grandmother, quiet, observant, and underestimated, was about to change everything. The truth didn't come out all at once. It leaked out slowly, like water finding cracks in a wall that had been pretending to be solid. At first, my grandmother noticed small things. She noticed how I hesitated before asking for anything, even water. She noticed how I flinched when something dropped, as if noise itself was a mistake. She noticed how I praised my stepmother without being asked, listing her sacrifices like rehearsed lines from a script I had memorized too well. I didn't realize how unnatural that sounded until I saw my grandmother's face change, not into anger, but into something quieter and heavier, concern mixed with recognition, like she had seen this pattern before, somewhere in her long life. Still, I said nothing directly. I told myself I was protecting my father. I told myself I didn't want to create drama. I told myself that everyone had problems at home, and this was just mine to handle. But beneath all those excuses was fear. Fear that if I spoke, I would be told I was exaggerating. Fear that I would be reminded to be grateful again. So I kept my story neat and acceptable. Back at home, my stepmother sensed something shift. She always did. She started asking more questions after my visits to my grandmother. Questions disguised as concern, questions that required the right answers. I learned to give them. But something inside me had already changed. Once you realize you are being watched for the wrong reasons, you also realize when someone watches you with care. The contrast was impossible to ignore. My grandmother didn't monitor me, she observed me. She didn't correct me, she listened to what I wasn't saying. One afternoon, while helping her organize old boxes in the storage room, I found my mother's belongings, letters, notebooks, photos. Evidence that she had been real, evidence that my grief wasn't imaginary or inconvenient. My grandmother let me sit there with those memories without rushing me, without reminding me of time or responsibility. That silence felt safe. I didn't cry loudly, I didn't break down dramatically. I just breathed differently, like someone who had been holding their breath for years and finally realized it. Later that evening, I caught myself apologizing for being emotional. The words left my mouth automatically, without thought. That was when my grandmother's eyes filled with something close to pain. She didn't tell me to stop. She didn't reassure me with empty comfort. She simply asked me to take my time. And in that moment, something inside me cracked wider than before. I began telling the truth, but not all of it. Not yet. I spoke about rules, about expectations, about how everything I did seemed to fall short. I framed it carefully, as misunderstandings, as differences in parenting styles. I made sure not to sound accusing. I made sure to include my own supposed faults. but even that partial truth was enough. My grandmother didn't interrupt, she didn't defend, she didn't excuse anyone. She just listened. And the longer she listened, the more I realized how rarely that had happened before. When I returned home after that visit, my stepmother's behavior sharpened. She became colder, more precise. She praised me in front of others while criticizing me privately. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, often and loudly. Gratitude became a debt I could never fully repay, and the word returned: ungrateful. She used it when I was tired, when I forgot small things, when I didn't perform happiness convincingly enough. She never said it angrily. That would have made it easier to explain. She said it calmly, as if stating a fact, as if diagnosing a condition. I started believing that word had replaced my name. My father still didn't see it, or maybe he saw fragments and chose the version that required the least disruption. When peace depends on denial, denial becomes very attractive. But my grandmother was no longer blind. She started asking me specific questions, not about feelings, but about patterns, about routines, about consequences, about how often I was reminded of my dependence, how often my gratitude was measured, how often my grief was inconvenient. Answering those questions felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. Each answer made something clearer, and clarity can be terrifying when you're not sure what it will demand of you. I worried constantly about loyalty, about betraying my father, about confirming my stepmother's accusations. I worried that if I told the full truth, I would lose the little stability I had left. But I was already losing myself. I noticed how different I was becoming, how small my voice had grown, how often I second-guessed my memories, how I blamed myself automatically. I had internalized surveillance. I monitored my own thoughts before anyone else could. That realization scared me more than confrontation ever could. One night, after my stepmother accused me of being ungrateful yet again, this time for something as simple as not being enthusiastic enough about a family dinner, I went to my room and stared at the ceiling for hours. I tried to remember who I had been before that word entered my life. The memory felt distant, faded. The next visit to my grandmother changed everything. This time, I didn't filter, I didn't soften, I didn't protect anyone else at my own expense. I told her about the emotional pressure, about the constant reminders, about how gratitude had been turned into a weapon, about how I was praised publicly and diminished privately, about how I felt like a guest in my own life. The words poured out faster than I expected. Years of silence don't come out neatly. They come out heavy and tangled, but they come out. And my grandmother finally understood, not just emotionally, but clearly. She didn't react with shock. She reacted with certainty, like someone who finally sees the full picture and knows exactly what it means. Her calm frightened me more than anger would have. She told me, without using dramatic language, that what I was experiencing wasn't discipline or adjustment. It was control disguised as care. It was emotional manipulation wrapped in responsibility. And most importantly, it wasn't my fault. Hearing that felt unreal. Not relieving at first, just unreal. Because when you've been told for years that the problem is you, the idea that it isn't feels like a lie. It takes time for truth to settle into a place where shame once lived. My grandmother promised me something that day, not loudly, not theatrically, but firmly. She promised she would not ignore this. She promised she would protect me in the ways she wished she had protected my mother from the world's sharp edges. I didn't fully believe her, not because I doubted her strength, but because I had learned not to expect rescue. But she was already moving. Quietly, observing, remembering, asking the right questions of the right people. And my stepmother, confident in her control, secure in her image, had no idea that the story she had carefully constructed was about to be challenged by someone who knew how to see through silence. The truth was no longer just mine, and once it left my chest, it began looking for justice.
Silence had always been her greatest weapon. My stepmother controlled the house not with anger, but with restraint. She never needed to shout because she understood something far more effective. If she stayed calm, reasonable, and composed, anyone who disagreed with her would automatically look emotional, unstable, or ungrateful. For years, that strategy worked perfectly, but silence only works when no one else is paying attention. My grandmother didn't rush in with accusations or dramatic confrontations. She didn't call family meetings or demand explanations. She did something far more unsettling. She observed, closely, patiently, without revealing her intentions. She began visiting more often. At first, it looked harmless, just a concerned grandmother wanting to spend time with her grandchild. My stepmother welcomed her warmly, almost proudly. She had nothing to hide, after all, or so she believed. I watched everything with quiet fear. Every interaction felt like walking through a room filled with glass. One wrong move and everything could shatter. I worried my stepmother would sense the shift and retaliate in subtle ways. I worried my father would feel caught in the middle and choose the path of least resistance, like he always had. But something different was happening this time. My grandmother noticed what others missed. She noticed how my stepmother spoke about me rather than to me, how praise always came with conditions, how generosity was always followed by reminders, how my mistakes were recorded but my efforts forgotten. She noticed how I reacted, not dramatically, not rebelliously, but with shrinking compliance, how I checked faces before speaking, how I apologized reflexively, how I waited for permission even when none was required. Those things told a story no performance could erase. My grandmother also noticed how my father responded, or didn't, how he stayed quiet during moments that required clarity, how he nodded along to narratives that framed him as the exhausted hero and me as the difficult responsibility, how comforted he seemed by order, even when that order was built on imbalance. I don't think he meant harm, but intention doesn't cancel impact. The house felt tense during those weeks, like a storm gathering just outside the walls. My stepmother grew increasingly performative. She emphasized routines, highlighted her efforts, spoke often about how hard it was to raise a child who wasn't hers. Each comment felt like a message, not just to my father, but to my grandmother. Look at me. Look how patient I am. Look how ungrateful the child is. But my grandmother wasn't watching the performance. She was watching the cracks. One afternoon, during a family gathering, something small happened, so small that most people would have missed it. I spilled a drink, just a few drops on the table. I froze instantly, heart racing, already rehearsing apologies. My stepmother smiled and said it was fine, but her eyes didn't match her words. That mismatch didn't escape my grandmother. Later that day, my grandmother asked me to help her outside. The moment we were alone, the tension I had been carrying broke open. I hadn't realized how much fear lived in my body until I felt it release in that quiet space. I didn't need to explain anything. She already knew, and she decided it was time, not for confrontation, but for exposure. My grandmother requested a private conversation with my father. No accusations, no dramatics, just concern. She spoke to him not as an enemy, but as someone who knew him long before his current life. She spoke as someone who remembered the man he used to be. She asked questions he couldn't dismiss. She asked about my behavior changes, about my fear, about my apologies, about my silence. She asked him when he had last truly listened to me, instead of listening about me. Those questions unsettled him. For the first time, he didn't have immediate answers. My stepmother sensed the shift almost immediately. Control is most threatened when it stops being invisible. She began tightening her grip in subtle ways. More reminders, more expectations, more carefully delivered guilt. But her timing was off. My grandmother was already several steps ahead. She began documenting patterns, dates, incidents, behaviors, not emotionally but methodically. She didn't frame anything as abuse, she framed it as evidence of a harmful dynamic, something impossible to argue against without looking unreasonable. When my stepmother realized she was no longer the only narrator, panic crept into her precision. Her calm began to crack. Small slips started happening, a sharp tone here, a dismissive comment there, moments where the mask slipped just enough for others to notice. And once people notice, they can't unsee. My father started noticing too. He noticed how often I withdrew, how little I spoke, how carefully I chose words. He noticed how different I was at my grandmother's house, more relaxed, more present, more alive. That contrast shook him. One evening, he asked me how I felt at home. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no tears, no shouting, just a quiet question asked too late. I answered honestly, but gently. I didn't accuse, I described. I explained how I felt like I was constantly failing, how gratitude felt like pressure, how I felt invisible unless I made a mistake. He listened, really listened, and I saw something shift in his expression. Guilt, confusion, recognition. My stepmother wasn't prepared for that. She tried to reframe it, to explain it away, to portray herself as misunderstood, but the words didn't land the way they used to. The certainty she relied on was gone, because now there were too many witnesses, not just my grandmother, not just me, but the truth itself, standing quietly between us, undeniable. My stepmother accused me again, this time openly. She called me ungrateful in front of everyone, expecting it to end the conversation the way it always had. But something was different. No one rushed to agree. No one nodded. No one corrected me. The silence turned against her, and for the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under it. I didn't feel victorious, I felt terrified. Change is scary even when it's necessary, especially when you're trained to fear conflict. But my grandmother didn't flinch. She calmly stated what she observed, not opinions, not feelings, facts, patterns, impact. She spoke with clarity and restraint, leaving no room for dramatics. And that was when the truth became unavoidable. My stepmother wasn't exposed as a villain, she was exposed as controlling, and control loses its power once it's named. The house would never be the same again. I had always believed that if the truth came out, everything would explode, that there would be shouting, blame, broken relationships, and chaos that couldn't be undone. I was wrong. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quieter than I expected, and far more powerful. Once control is exposed, it doesn't shatter instantly. It weakens, it slips, it struggles to hold shape. My stepmother didn't suddenly become cruel or aggressive. She became defensive, careful, measured in a new way, not to dominate, but to protect herself. That change alone told me everything. The word ungrateful disappeared from her vocabulary almost overnight, not because she no longer believed it, but because she understood it no longer worked. Power relies on belief, and belief had shifted. My father changed too. He didn't transform into a hero or demand immediate resolutions, but he started paying attention, real attention. He noticed tone, he noticed pauses, he noticed what was not said, and when he noticed, he intervened, not forcefully, but firmly. For the first time, I felt like someone was standing beside me instead of watching from a distance. The house still felt tense, but it no longer felt hostile. Boundaries began forming where none had existed before. Expectations were clarified. Accusations were questioned. Silence was no longer assumed to mean agreement. My stepmother struggled with that the most. She had built her authority on subtlety, on being seen as reasonable, on controlling the narrative without appearing controlling. Now, every move was visible. Every comment was weighed. Every sigh had meaning, and she hated it. She began framing herself as the victim, as the misunderstood caretaker, as the one whose intentions had been twisted. But those explanations no longer erased the impact. They no longer ended conversations.
My grandmother remained steady throughout it all. She didn't gloat, she didn't lecture, she didn't demand apologies. She stayed exactly where she had always been, present, observant, unmoving. She checked in on me quietly, making sure I wasn't being punished for speaking up. She reminded my father, gently but consistently, that protection is an action, not a feeling. Over time, the dynamic shifted. My stepmother stopped trying to control me and started keeping distance. The relationship didn't heal in the way movies suggest. There were no heartfelt apologies or emotional reconciliations. There was something else instead. Respect. Not the warm kind, the careful kind. And that was enough. I began to unlearn things I hadn't realized I had been taught. I stopped apologizing for neutral things. I stopped shrinking my presence. I stopped equating obedience with worth. It wasn't easy. Some habits cling like scars. But every time I caught myself slipping, my grandmother's voice grounded me in memory. Calm, certain, unmoved. She never told me to be grateful for survival. She reminded me that survival was not a favor. Eventually, my father acknowledged his failure, not publicly, not dramatically, but honestly. He admitted that he had chosen comfort over confrontation, that he had mistaken peace for health, that he hadn't protected me the way he should have. That acknowledgement mattered more than any punishment ever could. I didn't walk away from that house with everything repaired. Some relationships remain complicated. Some wounds leave marks even after they heal. But I walked away with something I had never had before: clarity. I learned that being called ungrateful is often a way to silence legitimate pain, that gratitude should never be demanded from someone who's already paying a price, and that people who fear the truth will always try to make you feel wrong for speaking it. Most importantly, I learned that I wasn't difficult. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't ungrateful. I was a child who needed safety, and I had a grandmother who refused to let that need be ignored. She called me ungrateful to control the story, but once my grandmother learned the truth, control was no longer hers to keep.